actually approached me, I don't know if it's a year ago, but maybe-ish, 6 or 7 months ago, something like that, and approached me about this topic. And I don't have a lot of experience with nonfiction, but I was excited and honored, and I still am, for what she wanted to do. And she did amazing work, and I think you're really going to enjoy hearing about the process of what she went through in the writing. There was a little bit of regrouping kind of in the middle part of this, and it just made it stronger, it made it better. We still have some work to do going forward, but again, I think it's in an excellent place, and I'm excited that you're all here. Thank you so much for coming to support Molly. We don't have students do independent studies a lot that are willing to share that experience with their peers and with those in the community, and so I appreciate that Molly's willing to do that, to just share her process with you. And at the end, when there's Q&A, I know she mentions it in the presentation, but we've talked about it, and no questions are off the table, so feel free, feel comfortable. She really wants to be open and transparent in that process. So thank you so much, Molly. We appreciate everything. Take it away.
When I was in 7th grade, I went to my junior high school's annual Christmas dance. Now, in junior high, they don't rent out nice spaces to have dances. They put all the kids in the cafeteria and turn the lights off and just blast some music. So I went to the school in my pretty red dress with my silver flats all ready to go. And I walk in, you can just see everyone segregated, the girls on one side, the boys on the other, not really wanting to interact with one another at that age. But I was just so excited to dance. And we were listening to the top hits at the time, just doing the Macarena to every song as I typically do. But then the first slow song comes on, and you can just see all the girls are antsy to see, is a guy gonna ask me to dance? Like, what's gonna happen? All the guys run out of the room, they take their bathroom break at that time. And I was just kind of hanging out, waiting to see what would happen. And this guy comes up to me, he's about a foot shorter than me, with hair that goes past his eyebrows, and he asks me to dance. And that was the first time that I danced with Brady Jacob Hunker. And so Brady and I became really close, obviously, and our families just grew close together, and we just started to do everything together, whether it was take weird selfies, acting like we had long mustaches, or riding in my sister's pink Cadillac Barbie car. Whatever it was, we just did it together, and our families grew really close. And as any good love story goes, our feelings started to grow for one another too, and we started to date in high school. And Brady was a hockey player, a really good one. He was the athlete, definitely not me. And so he would play hockey all the time. And when we were 15, he started to have some pain in his lower right leg, and we all just thought it was something to do with hockey, like one of his hockey injuries or something like that. But the pain persisted, and after a while, he went to the hospital to get it checked out, and they found that in his right leg, in between the two bones, there was a tumor the size of a brick. And at the age of 15, Brady was diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma, which is a childhood form of bone cancer. Obviously, getting the call at the age of 15 that my boyfriend at the time had cancer was devastating. It was not something I had planned would happen to me at such a young age, and certainly didn't think that it would happen to someone like Brady. But I was scared of stink bugs and of spiders, but not of cancer. And so I stuck with Brady throughout the time, and our relationship got closer. Even though the cancer spread at times, our love for one another grew even more. And so we continued to do everything together, and he continued to get chemotherapy and sometimes radiation, and I was pretty much always there. His mom said that I was his medicine, the Molly medicine, that would just help him feel better when he was in so much pain. Thankfully, he responded well to treatment at that time when we were sophomores in high school, and after 9 months, there was no evidence of disease and the cancer was gone. And so Brady and I had some time where we were able to experience life as kind of normal teenagers, but it's me, so is it ever really normal? Probably not. But we were able to like go to the movies and to go on regular dates and just enjoy life when we were juniors in high school. And we were just thinking about the future and big picture and just planning our lives together. And it was a really exciting time. But then towards the end of our junior year in high school, the pain returned. Brady went back to the hospital and found that the cancer had come back. And this time not just in his legs, but pretty much everywhere. Again, we were devastated, but we still stuck together. And when we were in seniors in high school, when you're thinking about, what you're gonna do after graduation, I know many of us seniors in college are thinking the same thing. Brady and I didn't know what the future held, but we know that we wanted to be together. And so in April of our senior year, doing the ring by spring thing, but not in college and high school, I got engaged. And these are just some of my favorite photos. I just love them. He probably said something silly to me and I laughed, which was normal. But we got engaged and we just started to plan a life together. Even though there was cancer, the love was stronger. And so in the summer after high school, in the hot heat of July, when it was 105 degrees, Brady and I got married, and it was such a beautiful day and just wonderful time with us together. And then after our wedding day in July, we came to Grove City College because, what else do you do after getting married? And so we came to Grove City and we started both as engineering students in the fall of 2019, and we were just really excited. I was a little overwhelmed by all the work that Grove City has us do, but we were doing it together, and so it was worth it. But then just 2 weeks after we had started classes here, Brady started to get really bad headaches, and pain is never a good sign. And so we went to the doctors again, and this time found that the cancer had spread to the lining of Brady's brain. And the doctors sat us down and said that there were no more drugs to give, that there were no more options for us. And less than 2 months after we got married, the doctors said that I only had about a month left with my husband, that Brady only had about a month left to live. Again, we were devastated, and we withdrew from the college at the time. We moved in with his parents, and in November of 2019, just about 4 months after we got married, Brady died, the week of Thanksgiving. And I became a widow at the age of 19. Never was in my plans. I had much bigger plans for my life. I wanted to go all over the world and become an engineer and solve all the world's problems, but then I found myself grieving and in the most deepest places of suffering that I could imagine. And Brady wasn't there anymore to experience the hard times with me. But as months went by, I just found that the grief continued to eat at me, but I knew I had to do something, and I felt that God was leading me back to Grove City College because that's where all good things happen, right? So I came back to Grove City in the spring of 2020, filled with grief, filled with sorrow, just hopeless, feeling like my life had ended before it could even begin. And then something crazy started to happen in me. I started to realize that God was with me still, even after so much pain had happened to me. Even after I had lost everything, I realized I did not lose Jesus. And that truth, that reality started to allow me to experience so much joy, so much hope, so much peace, and my life was chaos. I had lost everything that I had ever wanted was gone, but Jesus was still there. And because of that, I had joy. So I found that I was experiencing grief and joy at the same time. And I started to tell people about this weird experience that I was missing Brady, but so grateful to be alive because of Jesus, that I was so sad, but I was so happy because of what God had done. And I didn't really understand how those emotions could exist together. So I started to tell people about this grief and about this joy, but people could typically only accept one of those things. They wanted me to pick grief or pick joy, but I was experiencing them together. And so I wanted to keep on sharing my experience. And share with others what I had been going through. And that is the reason that I reached out to Dr. Miller about a year ago. I wanted to share my experience of grief and joy, of suffering and rejoicing through a book, through something called Rejoicing in the Mourning, Mourning. And that's when the process started. And so the plan was for this book was that I would write out my story pretty much in chronological order and share the lessons that God had taught me on the way. And so that was the plan that we had at the beginning. We had chapters laid out. I thought it was great. I was so excited. I'm like, this plan is great. And like everything else in my life, my plans did not work. I don't think there's ever been a moment that I have planned out something and it has gone well. So with that, there was this challenge that I knew what I wanted to say in this book. I knew I wanted to talk about grief and joy existing together, but I couldn't get the words on the page in a way that made sense. I just found myself repeating myself or just sounding clunky. It just wasn't working. And I was really discouraged at this point. I was thinking that, this idea that I had of sharing my experience wasn't going to work out, that I should just give up on the whole thing. But then Dr. Miller, as she always does, was so encouraging and told me or suggested that I have a different outline, that I think about the book in a different way. And so then that's when we came up with the solution of creating two different parts in this book, a part 1 and a part 2. And that's how the book looks today. So in part 1, I share about my story of love, loss, and grief, especially before Brady died. I talk about Brady's death at the end of part 1 in my book. And in part 2, I share about 6 different aspects of grief, 6 different elements of grief that I have experienced, and then share how I have found joy in those 6 different aspects. And I'll share a few of those aspects with you now so you get a clearer understanding of what I'm talking about. So first, I talk about grief being lonely. Whenever we lose someone that we love, there's this loneliness that comes because of a lost relationship, and also because we feel like we're misunderstood, that the world doesn't understand us when we have lost something. Grief is lonely, and God is with us. And for that, we rejoice. We rejoice because God is always with us. And so as I explain in the book, this element of grief, this aspect to grief, showed me more about who God was. Because when I felt like I had lost everything, I realized that I didn't lose Jesus. And even though Brady was gone, Jesus was with me. And I was lonely, but I wasn't alone. And for that, I rejoice. Another element of grief that I talk about is the pain of grief. Grief is painful. It makes us feel like there's no hope in the world. It physically hurts. I've experienced a lot of physical pain as I've been grieving the death of Brady. And God uses it. We rejoice because nothing is wasted. See, I really didn't understand that God is such a recycler until I had experienced this horrible, painful grief. I had read the verses in the Bible that say that God uses all things for good, but I really didn't understand that until I started to see God using the death of my husband for my good and for his glory. And that does not mean that Brady's death is good. It is not good. But God is good. And God uses all things. God wastes nothing. And for that, I rejoice. I'm grieving and it's painful, and I'm rejoicing because my God is good and he wastes nothing, not even my grief. And this is a quote that I have in this chapter where I talk about the pain of grief. And it says, "To acknowledge the pain of grief does not mean you deny the goodness of God." And that we can experience the pain of grief and the goodness of God in the same moment. That, grief is painful and God is good. And we can say those statements together and not contradict ourselves. And that's really the theme of this whole book, is that grief and joy, the goodness of God, the pain of grief, they're experienced together. Another aspect of grief that I talk about in my book is that grief is lasting. And yet we rejoice because life with God lasts forever. And so it's been about 3 years, just over 3 years, that Brady has died. And at this point, people start to ask me if I've moved on from Brady's death and from the grief. They ask, oh, are you like finished pretty much? Like that's all behind you, right? And the answer is no. There's no moving on from that kind of loss, from that kind of pain, from that kind of suffering, at least not on this earth. The grief lasts, even today, and I'm sure for many years I will be grieving Brady because he's not going to be here with me while I'm on earth. And yet I rejoice because my life with God lasts even longer than my grief. That because of what Jesus has done on the cross, I'm able to enter into eternal life with him when I place my faith in him. And that eternal life begins now, not just when I die. I'm entering into that eternal life with God now. And for that, I rejoice. And I rejoice because Brady's experiencing that eternal life now, and that in his fullest glory. And I rejoice in that. And my grief lasts because Brady is still not here with me, and I still grieve his absence. And there are a few other aspects of grief that I talk about in my book and have complementary aspects of joy that I share. But this is really the setup of the second part of my book, where I talk about an element of grief and how we can rejoice in that aspect of grief. And so there are a few takeaways that I want to share with you from this time of writing and just from my experience. And the one main takeaway is that we experience grief and joy together, especially as Christians. You know, you don't have to pick one. You can experience them together. And like I said before, when I first was experiencing the joy of the Lord in this terrible grief, I didn't understand how I was experiencing them together. And it's because I really didn't have a proper understanding of what grief was, and especially what joy is. And so grief is simply the response to loss. And in my book, I really emphasize the response to death. We can grieve other things besides a person, but in this book, I talk a lot about the grief that comes from death, the death of a loved one. And joy, to rejoice in God, is to take delight in who he is. You know, the joy that we have comes from God, not from our circumstances and not from our situations. And because our joy comes from God, we can rejoice in every season. Not because our life is always good in every season, but because God is always good. He is steadfast. He never changes. And so we can always rejoice in who he is. And truly, grief teaches us a lot about God because we see him working in the most terrible circumstances. And so grief is the response to loss. Rejoicing in God can happen all the time. And so grief and joy go together. And finally, I just want to share this takeaway of freedom, that there is freedom in this book. This book is not about trying to force people who are grieving to be happy and to just move on and act like life is great, because life is not great a lot of times for a lot of people. This book strives to help people see that there's freedom in grief and in joy, that God is not, forcing you to get to, over the hill of grief. He's there with you in the most terrible of circumstances. So there is freedom to grieve with authenticity, and there's freedom to rejoice in every circumstance. And so what's next? What's next for this project? What's next for me? I don't exactly know what's next for me, but I can tell you a little bit about what's next for this project. So the book is written. The draft is done. Praise God. So that's what I worked on this semester, was writing the book. So the book is written, but the book needs to be revised and needs to be edited. And there are a lot of things that I want to tweak and probably move around and mess with. So that's kind of the stage that I'm at in this project right now. So over the next few months and into the spring semester, I'll be working on revising the book, on editing it, on trying to make it publishable. And then also during this time, I'll be contacting agents to try to get the book out to publishers. At this point, I'm looking at going the traditional publishing route instead of self-publishing, though as we know, plans might change whenever I make them, so I'm holding it all with open hands. But the goal is to get this book published, and the next step is the revision process. And also, what's next for me is that over the course of the last few years, I've really received a strong call to ministry, and especially a ministry for those who are suffering and for those who mourn. Just because there are so many people that walk away from the faith whenever times get hard. That's the leading cause for people to walk away from God, is that they go through something terrible and they don't know how God is present in that time. And so I really feel a call to encourage those who are hurting. And that has come obviously from a lot of my experience in grief. And so I would love to have some sort of online support group whenever this book is published for widows or just for people who are really mourning the loss of a loved one, to connect and to have some sort of space for mutual encouragement. And I also plan to continue having speaking engagements where I share with others the truth of Christ in all circumstances, and that we can have joy in the Lord no matter what we go through. To conclude the presentation portion of our time together, I wanted to read parts of the book. I figured if I was presenting on the book, it would be nice if you could hear at least a paragraph from it. And so I'm going to be reading the end of part 1. This is the final section that I write about after I've shared my story of love and loss, and after I talk about Brady's death. This is the conclusion of part 1. On November 25th in 2019, I became a widow at the age of 19. That fact will always make me sad. On that same day, Brady was embraced by the arms of Jesus. That truth will always make me rejoice. To rejoice in the mourning does not mean that I neglect to grieve, but it means that I will still recognize the sweet and lasting hope we can all find in our Savior. Brady and I did not rejoice because of the cancer or because of his fleeting life, but he rejoiced, and I still rejoice because we do not suffer in vain. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus redeems it all. So thank you guys so much for being here and for supporting me. I just see so many familiar faces around the room, and I'm just so grateful for how so many of you have walked with me from the beginning of the journey in some cases, and I'm so grateful that you're here. And I also wanted to extend the biggest thank you to Dr. Miller. I could not have done this without you, and you've just been so encouraging every step of the way, and I'm just really grateful for you and for all that you've done to help me in this project. Thank you guys. So at this time, I would love to dive in deeper and answer any questions that you guys have, everything. You can ask me about the process of writing, about the project, or about grief and joy and kind of what that experience is like. As Dr. Miller mentioned before, I just really want to have a transparent conversation with you all, and I'm quite literally an open book now, so you're welcome to answer, to ask anything. So. I love that picture also.
Yeah. I'll go. I have not met you before, but my name is Dr. Skees, and I teach in the nursing department. And I first want to say that your story is amazing. I think that you share something that's quite unique because of what you've been through, because you have faith in Jesus, and that makes all the difference in the world. I'm a certified grief counselor too, so I've worked with people who don't have that kind of faith, and it makes a difference in their, I call it recovery, but it's not something you ever get over, because grief will last forever It does, but it will get less and less intense as time goes on for you. But it sounds like you've already made some great strides. And I was going to say, there was a saying by someone once that grief is the price you pay for loving someone. So every single one of us here is going to go through this at some point in your life, probably multiple times. And you already know that, and I think it's great that you can be a role model for other people. My question was going to be to ask you if you were thinking about what kinds of continuing bonds that you would want to engage in as a part of your grief process and recovery. And by that I mean something that helps you to always remember that person. But it sounds like you're well into that by writing this book and by wanting to be involved in online support groups and that kind of thing. And I was wondering, would you be thinking possibly about at some point maybe getting like not that you probably really need one, but it might help you to have like a certificate as a grief counselor?
Yeah, it's interesting. So many of my friends tell me that they see me being a counselor whenever I get older. Like, I've heard that encouragement before. It's not on my immediate like to-do list or plans, but it's not something that I would, it's something that I would definitely think about and have thought about before. I do plan on going to seminary next year, so that's kind of the education I plan on going to next. And I think there's such a need in Christian counseling, especially with grief, just because most of us don't want to talk about it, and I love to talk. I'm just kidding. So no, but there's definitely a need there, and so it's definitely an option that I would keep open. In terms of the bonds, I think writing is really therapeutic for me, and one of the last things that Brady told me before he died was that he wanted me to share our story with others, that would be how he would continue to live out his purpose in me. And so that's something that I see as a way to love him, is by continuing to write and to speak and to share our story. And in that way I feel really connected to him.
And I think you're going to make a huge difference for a lot of people, and I wish you the best in your journey.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, Molly, thanks so much for sharing your story with all of us. My question is, how do you think joy manifests itself externally to other people while you're really in the midst of the grieving process and bawling and crying?
Yeah, I think it looks different sometimes depending on how I'm feeling. And for me, I'm a super emotional person. Shocker, I know. But I am a very emotional person, so I have a lot of feelings. And so sometimes, like whenever I just had like a really tough month. The month of November is typically really difficult because that's the month where Brady got progressively sicker and where he died. So the month of November is really hard. So I think for me, what joy looked like this past month was just this like constant hope that I had, that like no matter how bad things got, I knew that Jesus would be with me. And sometimes that doesn't always translate to the external. Like sometimes people would look at me and say, oh, she's just super depressed and like hopeless. But even though I felt hopeless, I knew that there was still hope and that there was still joy there. And I find that like this time of year is specifically timing for me for Advent, as we're thinking about the coming of Jesus and this hope and peace and joy that we have in him. It's like always the perfect time every year. Other times where I'm feeling, where there's more external, showcases of joy, I think people have said that they just see this hope like in the way that I talk and the way that I worship, maybe especially, and just the expressions that I have. But I think sometimes, people share things externally differently, and we shouldn't like expect people to look a certain way when they grieve or when they have joy, but that, that can look in so many different ways. For sometimes when I'm crying and bawling my eyes out, I'm still like so grateful for Jesus and have so much hope and peace in him, even though it looks like I'm completely devastated, which I am, but it's more than that. So I think sometimes we can't always trust what we see on the outside of what's happening on the interior landscape.
How would you define joy?
So I have a few places where I define it in the book, and I define it as this delight that we have in the Lord because of what He's done or because of who He is. So I don't define it as just this like surface level happiness, but this like deep delight connected to gratitude for who God is and for what He's done. And obviously that can look a lot of different ways, but I think it comes from a place of delight and gratitude.
How has your grief changed in the last 3 years, and how has it stayed the same over the course of the 3 years?
Yeah, so as I explained in the book, the grief is lasting, but I explain that it looks different a lot of times. That in the beginning months, I experienced a lot of intense grief where I could not physically get out of bed, that I felt this barrier, this weight on me, that I feel like I couldn't function and do anything. Some people will describe that as acute grief, this like intense pain where you really can't function. So that was kind of what it looked like in the beginning stages, and I would just constantly be crying, though I still cry a lot, but it was just like a constant thing, and it would be all that I thought about. Like the first thing that I thought about in the morning was that Brady wasn't there, and like I just always was thinking of him not being with me. And I still think of Brady all the time, but it's different now. I'm able to kind of think of things, other things, and it's not always the first thing that I think of when I wake up in the morning, though sometimes it is. So I think for me, now I'm able to function more. Like I got out of bed this morning without much trouble, so in that way, that looks different. But also there are days when it feels like it felt at the very beginning, and I think especially in difficult months like November for me, some days I can't really distinguish a difference from the beginning months and from today. But I would say that the difference is I have those days less and less often as time goes on, but they still come. And I think also whenever Brady first died, every time that I thought of him, I was just super sad that he wasn't with me and that he wasn't here. But now when I think of Brady, I'm so like happy, and I have like such a smile on my face because I love him so much, and I still love him so much. And so in that way, I think the grief has changed a little bit from when he first died. But some days it still feels like the beginning again.
This is kind of a broad question, so answer kind of rule, but how would you say your journey with grief and joy has informed how to be a better friend, just in general, and how to love just your close friends more like Jesus?
Yeah, that's really good. Okay, I'll say it like this. So before Brady died, I really didn't have much experience with hard things in life. I mean, I had experienced like my boyfriend having cancer, so that was all really difficult, but I hadn't really experienced death. My grandparents had died, but I wasn't super close with them, so it didn't feel like I had much experience with death before. So whenever I would find out that someone else had died, the way that I would comfort or try to comfort those people would be to say something like, "Oh, I can't even imagine what you're going through, that's just so terrible," or just a bunch of Christian cliches that I could think of, like, "Oh, they're in a better place now, hip hip hooray, they're not suffering anymore," something like that. And I think after experiencing a close death myself, my views on how to comfort other people when they're grieving have completely changed, because when people would tell me that they couldn't imagine what I went through, I was always a little hurt because it always felt isolating. Like not only were other people not going through what I was going through, but they couldn't even empathize. They couldn't even imagine. Like that made me feel really isolated. And so saying those kind of, Hobby Lobby phrases of grief I've avoided when comforting other people, and have found that, just sitting and being present with them is really helpful and has been really helpful for me, and has been a way that I've tried to support other people. And I also think the hope is that over the years I will continue to give more and more grace to other people whenever they're going through a hard time, because I know I was a terrible daughter, I was a terrible sister, I was a terrible daughter-in-law whenever Brady first died. Like I treated those around me really poorly, and I don't want to give an excuse for that, but the reason that I treated other people poorly is I felt like I had no energy to do anything right myself. And so I think after experiencing grief over the last 3 years, my hope is that I will continue to offer grace to other people whenever they're suffering, and to not take offenses as personally. But I still take things personally, and I have still a lot of room to grow in. So that wasn't funny.
I think like my question would be like when you're talking about like how, when you go through like your rough months, like you feel like you like can't get out of bed and stuff, but like when you do get out of bed, like you're really happy about it and it's like a really big win. Like on those days, like how do you stay present and how do you stay trusting God when the weight of the world just feels like collapsing on you?
Yeah, so it's really difficult, and I think this is where Christian community plays a big role, and like we're not supposed to live life alone, like without Christians around us. And so I have been blessed over the last few years to have people in my life who can come alongside me on the days when are so terrible that I feel like I can't really survive it, that I can't really get through it. And there are times when I feel like I can't like move forward really, and there are people around me who kind of just pick me up and carry me, not physically, but you know, emotionally and even spiritually. And so I think sometimes, especially like we can get kind of legalistic in a way that like we need to like go to God in a very specific way, and if we don't do that, we fail our relationship with God, and God's going to be disappointed in us. But I think God is so loving and so patient with us whenever we're suffering. Like it's not like God is waiting for us to mess up. You know, he's just so compassionate and rich in mercy. And whenever we feel like we can't bring ourselves to him, he brings himself to us. I mean, that is the incarnation when Jesus came to this world in flesh. Like we couldn't go up to him, but he came to us. And so I think that that truth extends to grief too, is when we feel like we can't go to God, God will come to us. And that's when we have to trust that he'll be faithful in that, and that he will meet our needs when we feel like we can't bring ourselves to him. And so I think community with other people is super important, like to be honest with people around you whenever you're experiencing those times, like, hey, I'm having a terrible day, and hopefully, you know, they'll be with you and support you in a healthy way. But also just being honest with God about that, like, God, I'm having a terrible time. I am struggling to trust you right now, and just being honest with him and knowing that he will continue to be faithful and steadfast when life is hard. Easier said than done, obviously. Yeah.
So you talked about grieving for somebody who was also a Christian, but do you think it's different, and how it's different grieving for people who weren't believers?
Yeah, because I mention in the book that there's a certain amount of joy that I have because I know Brady had faith in Jesus. And I also know that that is not the case for all of us whenever we have people who die. And so that's a really good question. I would say that the work, so obviously, like, I can't imagine, or I struggle to imagine if Brady wasn't a believer, because that's like, that was the center of who he was. Like, he would have been a totally different person, and we wouldn't have been together had he not loved Jesus. But thinking of other people in my life that I know that aren't believers that I deeply love, and imagining if they had died, there would be an element to grief that I would feel for them, and that I would feel in general that I wouldn't have felt with Brady, because they didn't know Jesus. But I think there is still joy that can be found in that grief, because the work that God has done in my life is enough for me to rejoice in. And knowing that God is with me literally no matter what, like, or no matter any other circumstance, is enough. And so I think that, like, God is enough in himself, and even though other circumstances might be more complicated to work through when it comes to grief, and would bring up other thoughts and emotions that I'm not as familiar with, because Brady was a Christian, I do believe that there is still joy to be found in the grief, because God is no different in those circumstances than he has been in the circumstances that I've experienced. Like, God is still good. I still have saving faith in Jesus, and that would still cause joy, though it would be more complicated in other areas of the grief. That's just a really hard place to be in.
You mentioned before that a lot of people who often like face the same situation as you did, you said like they would like be tempted to leave the faith, or they would do that.
Mm-hmm.
Were you ever tempted to do the same thing, or to blame God on some level? If so, like how did you wrestle with like those thoughts and feelings?
Yeah, so I never would say that I was tempted to walk away from God. The language that I use is like, what I felt is like, if God was in the room, I felt like I couldn't look at him. Like, it would have been too much for me to look at God in the eye, like when Brady first died. Like, I just, almost like that kind of silent treatment that you give someone when you're upset. And I'm not really an angry person. Like, I wouldn't say that I was angry with God, but like, I felt like I just couldn't talk to him for a little bit. But I would say that that feeling over time led to me just asking God all the questions, like, why did this happen? Why did this happen to me? You know, like, I just asked why a lot, which is, I talk about this in the book, that grief is filled with questions, especially why. And I feel like over time, God encouraged me to start changing the questions. You know, instead of asking him why, ask him how he would use my grief for my good and for his glory. But there was certainly a time in the beginning stages where I felt like I couldn't look at God. But I wouldn't say that I blamed God or that I was angry with him. Maybe disappointed is a better word to use, that I was disappointed that he didn't heal Brady like I prayed for. But I wasn't tempted to leave the faith, because I knew that Jesus lived and died for me, and I couldn't ever, like, that was never, I never reconsidered that, though I was deeply upset, certainly. And still oftentimes get upset. There are still seasons that I walk through that I feel like I can't look at God, but he's still in the room with me. Yeah.
Maybe kind of a really obvious question, but especially after he died, were there a lot of moments or even little like character things, or possibly even today, that like people would say or do something that just like reminded you of him? And or the first few weeks and months especially, was it like almost everything was a reminder? And how was that difficulty, and especially like after you got out of the first few months or the first year, anytime you were reminded, what was that like?
Yeah, that's really good. So I would say, like, in the first, I don't know how many months, like literally everything reminded me of Brady. And I specifically remember this one example. It was the day before Brady's memorial service, and a few friends asked me to go to the mall with them, and they were trying to help me, you know, get distracted or distract myself from the grief, which is not ideal. Don't distract people from the grief. They can't be distracted. At least I shouldn't say that. I never prefer to be distracted from grief, but some people might prefer that. But anyway, when we went to the mall, we passed this one ski store that had, you know, these ski hoodies, and the first thing that I thought of was like, oh my gosh, Brady would have loved that hoodie, because he loved to snowboard and he just loved to buy the most expensive things, which was fun. But like, that was an example of when I was immediately reminded of Brady, and I started to talk about him, but my friends changed the subject, which was really painful for me. And so at the beginning, even at the beginning, whenever I would be reminded of Brady, I wasn't always like super sad about it. I just wanted to talk about him. Like, he's like, you know, one of my favorite people ever. And so I just want to talk about him all the time. Like, we all have our favorite people that whenever they come up in conversation, we get all excited and we just want to, you know, gush about them. That was true for Brady, and it didn't change after he died for me. For some people, it's really hard for them to talk about their loved one after they pass, but for me, that's just all I wanted to do. And so I would say that I still am reminded about Brady often, but probably not as often as I was when he first died, but I still like to talk about him whenever I'm reminded about him. And it's such a gift when people are willing to listen or when they ask questions. Like when people ask me questions about Brady, it's like the sweetest gift because I feel like I can share about him without being like a burden. You know what I mean? I hope that kind of made sense with the question. Kylie?
Going off of that, did you feel like you had friends that you could talk to about this with without feeling like a burden? And what did that look like for you? Because I know a lot of people say they don't want to burden people, but I know that sometimes friends want to be burdened, or is there a better way to say it than being burdened? Just can you talk about that?
Yeah. So I would say I really found friends when I came back to Grove City. That was like the source of a lot of joy for me. When I came back to Grove City in the spring of 2020, I met these people in the touring choir that I still am so close with, and they were so invested in me and in my relationship with Brady, and they just, I think a way that I felt comfortable talking about him with them was that they just asked the questions. You know, I didn't have to bring Brady up. They asked me, you know, how are you feeling today? How is your grief going? Or, oh, can you tell me how you and Brady met? Or like, can you share with me the story of how he proposed to you? Like whenever they would ask questions, I felt the space to be able to share without, you know, feeling like a burden because they brought it up. So I think when other people bring up Brady, that's what feels most helpful, that I can share without feeling bad about it. But oftentimes I'll just share anyway because I love talking about him so much. But some people can get visibly uncomfortable with that, which is tough to deal with.
Now that you've been through this process of writing about your own story and kind of looking back on how grief and joy have been part of it and still are part of it, what kinds of questions do you still have, or things that you still wonder about the relationship with grief and joy?
Yeah, sometimes whenever I'm experiencing like really intense grief like this past month, there have been times that I'm like, how can I rejoice right now? Like there are still moments where I'm like, is this still possible? Whenever the pain is so great. And the answer that I continue to find, even though I continue to ask the question and continue to wonder, is that like, yes, I can because God is still here. I think sometimes the harder thing is figuring out how God is present, because when I see how God is present, it's like, thank you, Jesus, I can rejoice in that. But sometimes I still ask myself, like, how, like, where is God in this? And just because I've seen God before and he's been faithful, and I still will ask, like, God, where are you? Even though I know he's right there. And so I think even after going through 3 years of this, I still sometimes ask, like, is joy possible? And that's part of why I'm so passionate about sharing that it is possible, because like we need to be reminded of it all the time whenever things are so hard, that joy is available to us as Christians, even though the grief is there too.
I don't know if you've been like experiencing this personally, but if you want to share your own experiences or just based on like what you would expect from what you have experienced, what would it look like to like not move on, but to like explore other like romantic relationships while still maintaining like a grief and a joy?
I laughed because my boyfriend's sitting right in front of you. Typically don't laugh at him. That's a lie. But so this is like always what people are super curious about, like whether they ask it or not. So I'm grateful that you brought it up because I like want to have a transparent conversation. And so the first time someone asked me if I would like consider dating again, or they used the term remarry. It was 2 days after Brady had died. I got a Facebook message, and it said, it was misspelled, so I don't exactly remember the spelling, but it said, "So sorry for your loss, will you remarry?" And at that time I felt like, bruh, like I hadn't even had his memorial service, like please take a chill pill. So at that time I felt really insensitive, and obviously like I wouldn't recommend texting a widow less than 2 days after her husband dies and asking her if she's gonna get a new man soon. At least do it in person. If you're gonna do that, no, don't do it. But anyway, so going to your question, like how do I hold, I'm pretty much gonna answer like how do you hold grief and also hope and like enjoying a new person. And so for me, I feel like that's kind of the theme of this whole book, is that you experience them together. And so when I started dating again, like I did not stop grieving Brady, and I did not stop missing him, and I certainly did not stop loving him. But I began to have feelings for another person, and that can be like, I thought it would be super confusing and weird and like really odd, but it wasn't. It was really quite natural, and it felt like such a gift. Like I had such a gift with Brady, and I miss him, and then God's like, here's this other gift that I want you to experience. And so I feel like with grief and joy, like I experience them together, and I really focus on not allowing myself to feel like guilty for being really happy in this new relationship, even though like I experienced so much heartache before, that like I'm able to experience them both at the same time. And so it's like a practice of holding two things in the same hand at the same time. And it can be like maybe complicated sometimes, but other times it's like you live it out and you get it. And it might be one of those things that it's easier to experience than it is to explain, but you hold them together.
I did hear your talk actually, just so you know, I was on the call. But I wasn't quite sure, did you mention anything about heaven as far as your knowledge of heaven having expanded at all since Brady died? Or have you read about it more, just as curious, or, you know, there's the scriptures kind of like, about it. It's clear that it's there, but you know, it's hard to get it.
Yeah, like what is it like?
Yeah.
Right. So I haven't read like a ton about it since Brady's died. Like it's not been something that's been like a real topic of interest for me necessarily, but I think like I have gotten like visions and dreams of Brady worshiping God in heaven, which has been like such a gift. Like there was a time, like a month after Brady died, it was Christmas. And so on the Christmas Eve service, like we were singing Hark the Herald Angels Sing, which is one of my favorite hymns. And I just, as I was worshiping God, I was feeling like quite hopeless at that time. Like it was about a month after Brady died. And as I was singing, I like saw this vision of Brady worshiping Jesus in heaven. And there was such this beauty that I realized that like Brady and I were both worshiping the same God, like in different places, like different contexts, but like we were still united in our worship. And that was this beautiful realization that like, I think when I think of heaven, I just think of this place of worship all the time, which is what we strive to have here on earth. And so in that way, like I just have a lot of hope and confidence of where Brady is, but I haven't thought a lot about like, you know, what the streets look like or what life is. But I think when I do think of heaven, I just am so glad that Brady is there, you know, because I do have that confidence that he is with Jesus. Yeah, Dr. Campbell.
Molly, were there particular scriptures that kept encouraging you, or maybe some books that you read that were very good?
Yeah, the Bible is so good. So obviously, I found the book of Job to be really helpful, and I still read it often, and I'm like, yeah, like Job gets it. You know, like it's just so relatable to me after Brady died. And I think especially at the end of the book of Job, when God talks to Job, when God speaks, it's so comforting that God speaks about himself and not about Job's experience, because that's relatable for all of us. Like, God might not speak to our specific experience, but he's always talking and sharing about himself and like sharing more of himself with us. So I think that book has been really helpful for me. And the book of James also, with the first verses that we are to consider it joy whenever we face trials of many kinds, like that verse kind of started to get me thinking, like, wait, we can experience joy and suffering together? What? Like, that kind of sparked my curiosity for really praying into these topics and everything. But I think the book of Job has probably been the most helpful in scripture. Though the more I read, the more like other passages speak to me too about it, but Job was the first. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate you guys coming and supporting me, and just for all of your love. I really appreciate it, and it's such a joy to share my experience of grief and joy with you all. So thank you again.